The Traitor Legions all have their own strengths and weaknesses, but some are better than others.
And this is a symbol of what I think of the Employee of the Month Award!
An experienced Employee of the Month always keeps a brick of lead in his hat.
Hi, I'm Chrono the Harlequin, and today I want to talk to you about which Traitor Space Marine Legion is the best and why. Before that though, I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video. Please subscribe if you have not already done so, and consider supporting me on Patreon as it does really help me out. But without any further ado, let's get into which Traitor Space Marine Legion is the best. The thing is though, deciding on what is the best is a really tall order, because all Space Marine Legions, again, have their own strengths and weaknesses, and their own unique way of doing things. However, with different methods will often come varying degrees of outcome. So the parameters I'm going to use to judge which legions are better than others are things such as threat level they pose to the Imperium, operational capabilities, general presentation in terms of things like their theme, their goals, their aesthetic, and their lore, as well as what notable characters they have for various kinds of storytelling, at least so far. I know there's always room for improvement later down the line, such as new storylines, changes up to the lore, new characters being introduced, but I'm basically going on what we have thus far. Also, it should go without saying, this is probably one of, if not the single most subjective video I have ever made, so reasonably somebody could disagree with this entire listing. Now, before we decide on who's the best, let's get out of the way who is the worst. And I think the worst Traitor Legion actually has to be the Alpha Legion. The reason being, they're not all traitors. As you know, if you've been following my channel for basically any amount of time at this point, the Alpha Legion was actually playing both sides of the Horus Heresy on purpose because they didn't know what would be the best way to guarantee the destruction of chaos, something they wanted to avoid. However, that would all go to putz when one of their Primarchs would be killed by Rogel Dorn in the Battle of Pluto, thereby leaving them rudderless and kind of dead in the water, at which point they would largely withdraw from the heresy. However, in the intervening 10,000 years, most of them would eventually slide into being traitors, especially since a lot of them didn't go towards the Eye of Terror, so a lot of the Space Marines currently alive in the Alpha Legion either did go to the Eye of Terror, or are newer generations of them. However, some loyalist elements do still persist, so that does actually take a big bite out of them being a quote-unquote effective Traitor Legion. Also, in the book Harrowmaster by Mike Brooks, it is shown that a lot of those Alpha Legion who are traitors don't really know what they're doing. In essence, a lot of them are just messing around. Yeah, they're enacting schemes here and there, and taking a bite here and a bite there out of the Imperium's resources, but aside from a few very rare individuals like Quetzal Carthage who eliminated several Ultramarine successor chapters, they haven't been doing much at all. And this is actually the point of the book Harrowmaster by Mike Brooks, wherein Solomon Akura, one of these new Alpha Legionnaires, basically gets as many of his brothers as he can together and says, guys, we are literally doing nothing, it's time to get the lead out and try accomplishing something for once. So I think we can safely put them at the bottom of the list. And similarly, but not quite as bad, is the Night Lords, because they too do not have a Primarch leading them, and have not been accomplishing all that much. Sure, when they do things it's really scary, but generally speaking, they mostly function as pirates and raiders, not really going out of their way to say, take any planets or really hit the Imperium where it hurts. They're just around. And sure, sometimes they'll be recruited by other Space Marine Legions just to help zest up their lineup if they're gonna go on a big crusade or campaign, but generally speaking, they're doing essentially nothing. And this is again also acknowledged by one of the people who wants to take charge of the Legion, the legionary named Talos, who basically says, guys, we are literally accomplishing nothing, we only ever fight when we have an overwhelming advantage and run the second things go south, let's do something with ourselves. We did though never get a follow-up of his big plans. I will say this though, one thing that carries the Night Lords over the Alpha Legion in this regard is the sheer traitorousness of their aesthetic. It is absolutely terrifying, gorgeous, and brutal, and they did all of that without chaos as a crutch. That says something. Now, the thing about the Alpha Legion being a worse Traitor Legion was again partly way of disqualification, but I think a very big problem with the Night Lords here that puts them at the bottom of the actual Traitor Legion list is because of just how few iconic characters they have. Like, name a Night Lord. aside from Talos and his guys, name a Night Lord. Hardly anybody comes to mind because there's just nobody to pick from and no opportunities for them to distinguish themselves. And in a similar vein, I would put near the bottom of the list, and this is going to make some people unhappy, the Thousand Sons. And that's because, again, they don't do all that much in the lore, despite having one of the most killer aesthetics out of them all. It is absolutely gorgeous. They don't do a lot aside from just obsessing over fighting the Space Wolves. 90% of the time when you hear about them doing anything as a group and not just as individual sorcerers, it's because they're going after the Space Wolves or going after Fenris. Now, I put them ahead of the Night Lords because they do still do things here and there, but again, it's usually individual sorcerers acting on their own initiative. And of course, there is the ongoing storyline with Ahriman in his quest to try and cure the Legion of the rubric that he inflicted on it, to bring so many of his brothers back to life where he turned them to dust. I think that's very interesting, and the gimmick of these dust automaton marines is a really cool one. But again, they are woefully underutilized, which is why I think it was so cool they were one of the mainline enemies in Space Marine 2. There's also the fact that Tzeentch as a Chaos God is the one that gets the least play, because that lure of knowledge is just not as compelling as, say, the Bloodlust of Khorne, or the Plagues of Nurgle, or the Sensations of Slaanesh. One good thing I will say about them, though, is that they do have a very strong presence in the Black Legion, which makes good use of their sorceress abilities. In fact, one of the founding members of the Black Legion is Iskandir Kaon, a potent sorcerer of the Thousand Sons. My big recommendation for them would be to not necessarily have them unite around a central figure like Magnus or Ahriman, but just have them be more active in the galaxy in general. Give them some kind of enemy to set themselves toward. The Death Guard were fighting the Tau and the Ultramarines, the Iron Warriors always have their best friends, the Imperial Fists, but just limiting the Thousand Sons to the Space Wolves kind of kneecaps their storytelling potential because the Space Wolves themselves are not doing much. I think a good idea would be to pit them against the Eldari, because there they can sort of psychically match wits with an opponent that actually poses a threat to them. Next up on the list is the Sons of Horus. No, not the Black Legion, the Sons of Horus, because these guys actually are still kicking around. You see, after the Traitor Legions fled to the Eye of Terror, where they were regrouping and licking their wounds, they all started going at each other's throats for whatever resources they had, and to just sort of, I guess, blow off steam, and all of them set themselves against the Sons of Horus, who they more or less blamed for having dragged them into this mess to begin with. And it really did seem like the Sons of Horus might just be wiped out, until Abaddon came out of his exile and reformed them into the Black Legion. However, not all of them would accept Abaddon's rule, and some of them still maintain the old name and colors of their legion. These groups are known as the Thrice Cursed Traitors, and are basically hated by everybody, especially Abaddon, who persecutes them mercilessly wherever he finds them. And most of them have been wiped out over the millennia, but some do persist, such as the Wolves of Horus, who basically yearn for the days of the Luna Wolves and still continue to venerate their now disgraced dead Primarch by continuing to bear his name. And they're not alone. Another one are the True Sons, who still worship Horus as a god, as he was towards the end of the Crusade, and will build effigies of him wherever they can before setting them alight. What makes these guys so interesting to me is the fact that they are literally keeping a dead legion alive. That takes some absolutely insane dedication. And there's also the fact that the Sons of Horus color palette is one of my absolute favorites, especially that rich green color they had, and I'm really sad that it's no longer in use, so it is nice that there's still some people repping it even 10,000 years later. I think I'm kind of putting these guys as high as they are because I feel like a lot of people simply don't know they exist and would just be surprised to hear about them, and I find that dedication just so interesting to me. It's just really unfortunate though that we're never gonna see these guys do anything of note or anything significant, and they're never gonna feature in any mainline books or stories, but still, the fact that they exist, I think is really cool. Above them, though, is the Emperor's Children. Now this is where we start getting into the real heavy hitters, because even though the Sons of Fulgrim are one of the most fractured legions of them all, they are still very, very potent on both the micro and macro scale. Granted, they can't really unite all that well given just how chaotic and disturbed a lot of them are, but when they can muster up a significant force, there's gonna be hell to pay. However, just individual Emperor's children doing their thing, taking heads, can still wreak a lot of havoc. Also, small bands of Emperor's children will literally take over entire planets and use them as their own personal fiefdoms, shaping the world as they see fit. That being horrifyingly. So even though they don't do much large scale, they still do get a lot done. Plus, like the Thousand Sons, they also have a unique unit type, that being the Noise Marines, who utilize powerful sonic weaponry and screams to decimate their foes on the battlefield. Interestingly though, when you run into Noise Marines in the lore, they're oftentimes very chill people, being in tune with the quote, sounds of the warp and the song of all creation and destruction. It's something that's come up more than once, and it's got an almost Buddhist feel to it. They like to be sequestered away in their sort of choir rooms where they just listen to the resonances and take it all in, only coming out when asked to by their lords to really do some damage. And here's the thing that kind of puts them above the Thousand Sons. You see, the Thousand Sons are always sort of scheming and studying and doing things like that, and it kind of leaves them very much sequestered. But the Emperor's children are not afraid to strike out and start doing big things, so we just end up seeing more of them. Plus, they're not fixated on just pursuing one enemy, that being the Space Wolves for the Thousand Sons. And I will say, I like the Noise Marines more than the Rubric Marines, even though the Rubric Marines have a cooler aesthetic in my opinion. And that's because even though the Rubric Marines are these automatons made of dust, they still have more or less the same weapons as any other Chaos Space Marine. Hell, they don't even utilize the sorcery that the Legion is famous for, so they're not really all that different from a regular Chaos Marine, aside from the fact that they're just more impervious to physical injury and are entirely obedient. But the Noise Marines have very unique weaponry and armor, often containing giant speakers and enormous sonic blasters that just look so cool. Plus, the Legion also has a big emphasis on blade work, but not the savage hacking and slashing of the World Eaters. Instead, it's the artistry of the technique. Also, the character of these guys is often very, very fun to read because they're so catty and petty, constantly sneering and insulting each other and always wanting to outdo the other. Always thinking, oh, he stole my glory. No, he's putting me on the backbench because he's jealous of me. Like, they're so wildly immature despite being so terrifying, and that's just a treat to read about. And this is coupled with the fact that they have, far and away, some of the best characters out of any of the Traitor legions. Lucius the Eternal, the unkillable Herald of Slanesh, with his agonizer whip and his ability to always come back. Eidolon, the Lord Commander who can literally stand up to his own Primarch, and can actually provide a sense of leadership to these chaotic, insane Marines. One of the few Traitor Marines who can actually stand eye to eye with Abaddon in terms of the power he commands. Not to mention the fact that he literally had his head cut off but got it put back. And of course, Fabius Bile, the chief apothecary of the Legion turned mad scientist, who now is effectively shaping up to be one of the main antagonists of the story of Warhammer 40,000 as it moves forward, being set up as a rival to Fabius Bile and creating his own race of humanoids called New Men that he expects to one day replace humanity as the dominant species in the galaxy, all while he tries to run away from his own mortality, jumping from clone body to clone body, all of which decay faster than the last. There is so much going on, and it is all amazing. Whenever the Emperor's children are mentioned, you are in for a treat. Now, the reason they aren't higher on the list is because I find them woefully underutilized. Because while Fulgrim is returning to the galaxy, and Eidolon can serve as a source of leadership, it doesn't really happen all that much. And we do hear words about them doing things as a united force, but it's often, again, very rare. Still though, I really hope we see more of them as a large cohesive force moving forward, something that is entirely possible given that, again, Fulgrim is returning. Next up is number 6, the Black Legion, and they're more or less the baseline here. This is sort of the just above halfway point, so I think it is safe to say that the Black Legion falls here because they are kind of the baseline when you think Traitor Space Marines. They're not overly amazing in any way, but there's not any way in which they're lacking, aside from one, and that's their aesthetic. The whole design philosophy is just black armor with gold trim. It's kind of in the Legion's motto, in black and gold reborn. And don't get me wrong, it's a good, classic, menacing aesthetic, but it's just not all that interesting, especially since the Imperium of Man uses no small amount of black themselves. Like, a giant battle between the Black Legion and the Black Templars, or the Black Legion and the Raven Guard, wouldn't really be the most interesting visual in all of Warhammer, in my opinion. What is great about the Black Legion, though, is their story. You see, as previously mentioned, the Sons of Horus would be effectively scapegoated by the other traitor legions during the Legion Wars in the Eye of Terror, or as they call it, the Empire of the Eye. However, their saving grace would come in the form of Abaddon the Despoiler coming out of his self-imposed exile and taking charge of the remnants of the Sons of Horus, as well as those from other traitor legions who are willing to stand alongside him, and forming the Black Legion, which he would then use to launch the First Black Crusade, and every subsequent Black Crusade thereafter, culminating in the destruction of Cadia with the 13th Black Crusade. And that's a big part of why they're this far on the list. They are, without question, the most preeminent threat to the Imperium of Man out of all the traitor legions by far. And it's not just the Black Crusades. They're known to be active in their own small cells because they actually have a lot of flexibility in their ranks, and will only join together when Abaddon gives the word to do so, with other Black Legion groups fighting against each other, which can make things a bit more interesting. However, that lack of a cohesive, clear theme does kind of bring the Legion down a little bit and make them seem a little bit bland, essentially making them the Ultramarines of the traitor legions. What kinda makes them the opposite of the Ultramarines, though, is instead of winning all the time and having plot armor, they lose all the time and have basically plot weak points. Like, yes, they did destroy Cadia with the 13th Black Crusade, but it took them 13 of those things and 10,000 years to get that far. Also, they do have a large amount of named characters, but most of them don't show up. We haven't seen Iskandar Kaon or Falkus Kyber in quite some time, and the only real, consistent, evergreen main character that they have is Abaddon the Despoiler. Granted, he is literally one of the biggest, most iconic and recognizable characters in all of Warhammer, and has been considered the principal antagonist for decades at this point, but it says a lot that, 1, he is literally nicknamed Failbadon and otherwise mocked behind his back by a lot of other characters, and 2, I literally went out of my way to make a video dissecting whether or not he's a good commander. I came up with the conclusion that, yeah, he probably is pretty decent all things considered, but it really says a lot that you can even ask the question to begin with, is this guy a genius or just an idiot? And for there to be a reasonable argument towards both. So the Black Legion, even though they are pretty good, does get a lot of hate thrown their way, and it's not without reason, so that definitely did keep them from the top spot. That mix of both a lot of reputation and not all of it being good, coupled with their less than stellar aesthetic. Speaking of aesthetic though, next on the list is the Death Guard. Now here is where we start getting into the really strong legions. Specifically, there are 3 legions as stated in the book The Lords of Silence by Chris Wraith that kept their old cohesion and disciplines, and the Death Guard is absolutely one of them. A big part of this is because they are the most enthusiastically spiritual out of all the legions. Yes, even compared to the Word-Bearers. The Word-Bearers are very much devoted, but the love the Death Guard have for Nurgle is really something else and does kind of set them apart. Plus, their aesthetic of zombie space marines is just really interesting, and plague marines, while maybe not as readily interesting as, say, noise marines, are still really cool. And again, much like the Black Legion, they represent a horrifyingly potent threat to the Imperium. As you can see with the Plague Wars, when the Death Guard, led by Mortarion, would invade the realm of Ultramar and come very close to literally just toppling it. However, this would lead to the resurrection of Rabute Guilliman and the banishment of Mortarion. Still though, Mortarion is at least active on the galactic stage as opposed to many of the other fallen Primarchs. But again, he's not the most effective and he just got himself banished. And it's not the first time either. Another really neat thing about the Death Guard is also their campaigns against the Tau Empire. Like, they're actually making plays other than just Chaos versus Imperium, and that does say something, even though it was relatively short-lived. And they also have a great character aside from just Mortarion, that being First Captain Callus Typhon, because he is actually the first person to fall to Chaos outside of Erebus. He is actually one of what are referred to as the 4 heralds of the Chaos Gods, that being Azek Ahriman of the Thousand Suns, Lucius the Eternal of the Emperor's Children, Karn the Betrayer of the World Eaters, and Typhon of the Death Guard. And I actually would count Erebus as a herald of the Chaos Gods, but he's the one for Chaos Undivided. One thing though that does hold them back from some of the higher spots on the list, and it's because they've become a little oversaturated over the years, and they are in fact one of the most common traitor legions to show up, aside from the Black Legion itself. And this might be just a me thing, but given my age, I was in high school right when the zombie craze was literally sweeping the entire, northern hemisphere. Even back when I was in middle school, zombies were the thing everywhere. The Zombie Survival Guide, World War Z, not the movie, the actual book. And then when I got to high school, it was just The Walking Dead, The Walking Dead, The Walking Dead everywhere alongside Game of Thrones. So I think I and a lot of other people are just kind of sick of zombies in a lot of ways, but with that in mind, I don't think I could conscionably put the Death Guard any lower than this. Next on the list, though, is the World Eaters. And I'm gonna say this one was very close with the Death Guard, and I would almost name these two as practically interchangeable in their ranking. You see, unlike the Death Guard, the World Eaters were absolutely broken as a legion, both by Karn the Betrayer and their own incredible instability, making it hard for them to work together as one cohesive group. However, they are capable of doing that, especially given Angron has returned to the galaxy and will now be apparently coming back from the warp a lot faster than normal demon Primarchs. So they have actually been grouping up a lot more, and in fact their large actions were one of the driving forces behind the Arcs of Omen campaign. Plus, they again do have Karn the Betrayer, one of the most well-known characters in all of Warhammer. And I think what puts them above the Death Guard, even though they are maybe not as cohesive of a group, is the fact that they are just incredibly iconic. Like, I have friends who know literally nothing about Warhammer, but they still know blood for the Blood God, skulls for the Skull Throne. And in fact, that's oftentimes the first thing a lot of people learn about Warhammer alongside For the Emperor and what a Space Marine is. They're just so wildly ubiquitous, and people are often surprised that they don't play a bigger role in the story. Plus, even though they are still broken as a group, they are very dangerous because their wild berserk fury sort of makes up for their lack of cohesion and maybe not as amazing numbers on the battlefield. Also, when you read books that show the World Eaters as characters, they're very, very interesting. Don't get me wrong, the Death Guard are cool too, but the World Eaters have this kind of nobility to them that you can see just under the madness of the nails, even 10,000 years later. And that internal conflict, that push and pull between their animalistic nature versus the warrior underneath, really does make for some great reading. Also, a lot of the newer designs for the World Eaters look really, really cool. Now, don't get me wrong, all the Traitor Legions with unique units and models tend to look good, like the Night Lords ones are really awesome, and the Death Guard have, again, a very unique aesthetic, but I feel like there's just something about the World Eaters ones, with the Butcher's Nails and the sleeveless power armor showing off their bulging oversized biceps with ports sticking out of the skin, that looks really cool to me. So I think it's pretty clear why these guys are as high up as they are on my listing, but in my mind the only thing really holding them back is the fact that 1, Angron has kind of ceased to be a character as a Primarch and is instead just like an animal at this point, and they, again, lack cohesion as a legion and don't really have an overall motivation. Because a part of the appeal is finding a balance between having a legion motivation, kind of like with the Death Guard and their worship of Nurgle, but not being overly consumed by it to the detriment of everything else, like with the Thousand Suns and their rivalry with the Space Wolves. However, alternatively, you can basically throw the World Eaters into any situation without really having to wonder what they're doing there. Like with the Black Legion, you'll wonder, what's their larger strategic aim here? With the Night Lords, you'll wonder, why are they even attacking this planet? Usually they're only attacking to, again, skin and terrorize people or if they have an advantage. But the World Eaters will literally just go for anything. Now, before I get into the top 2, I would like to throw out my honorable mention. That being the Red Corsairs. And yeah, I know there's a myriad chaos warbands and different groups and renegade chapters, but the vast majority of them are only ever really mentioned as footnotes in codexes. Now, I will say, I wish I could say more about the Red Corsairs because I haven't read their book, Huron Master of the Maelstrom, yet, but I really should get to it. However, I think the idea of the Red Corsairs is really cool, because, like, whenever anyone talks about Traitor Marines, 99% of the time, they're talking about the original 8 legions and the Black Legion. And with that comes all that entails. You know, specifically the 4 Chaos Gods, those legions that have been broken into war bands, the Demon Primarchs, the Eye of Terror and the Black Crusades, and of course, the 10,000-year grudge against the Imperium of Man. All that same bad blood back from the Horus Heresy. The Red Corsairs, however, have their own iconic leader, Huron the Tyrant of Badab, and their own war that they fought, which led to them fully turning traitor and seceding from the Imperium, that being the Badab War. Furthermore, they're more just piratical and like to just be a pain in the Imperium's ass, which is a very interesting motivation, because it's less about the bad blood and the false emperor and this and that, and more so was brought about by taxation disputes. Plus, them having their own stomping ground, that being the Maelstrom instead of the Eye of Terror, essentially opens up the whole other half of the galaxy, which I think is great. But as previously stated, I can't really rank them higher because I haven't read their book yet. And while I wouldn't call this next one an honorable mention, it's at the very least an acknowledgement, and that is towards the Sons of Malice, the renegade chapter who worships the alleged 5th Chaos God Malal, who is devoted to complete anarchy. Now, it should be noted, Malal has basically been booted out of the GW canon and is not gonna come back. And you know how GW is, if they can't make money off something, they're not gonna do it. Now, again, we have seen very little of the Sons of Malice, and it's literally not even clear if they're still canon. But it should be noted, they have a great color scheme. Like, I'm gonna give them that, and that's really all I can give them. I will say though, if they do ever get brought back into the canon properly, I think they should still keep worshipping this 5th Chaos God of Anarchy, even though there is no such thing. Like, have them as just these weird scene kids who are basically insisting, no guys, there is totally this 5th Chaos God, you just don't know it yet because you're not, like, worthy. It's so elite, you don't even know. Like these massive hipster Chaos Space Marines who everyone just makes fun of. And now, in second place is the Iron Warriors. And I love these guys, as many of you know, simply because they do not seem like the other Traitor Legions in many regards. They are, again, one of the 3 great legions, that being the ones that maintained their old structures and disciplines. And as such, they are one of the preeminent threats to the Imperium outside of the Black Legion. Plus, they exhibit a kind of pragmatism and efficiency that you just don't see anywhere else. They maintain excellent supply lines, manufactories, good relations with the Dark Mechanicum, and often keep their numbers much higher than other Traitor Legions, specifically because, 1, they have a great organizational structure, and 2, they're more than willing to make new Space Marines, that being chimeric ones made from various different gene stocks and gene seeds, such is the case with, unfortunately, the only really notable character they have on the board at this time, that being Hansu, who is a mix of Iron Warriors and Imperial Fists gene stock. But the thing about Hansu, he is one of the most highly regarded Iron Warriors out there altogether. So despite his almost comical gene seed mixture, he is literally known to have audience with Perturabo himself, who talks with him pretty casually and openly. So for someone who was not part of the Long War and who is part Imperial Fist, to get that highly up in the ranks of this long-established legion really says a lot about their commitment to meritocracy, something that has allowed them to remain a much more astute fighting force throughout the millennia than some of the other legions. And this is partly spurred on by Perturabo, who actually still is active in the running of the legion. Granted, he kind of takes a back seat nowadays, having ascended to Demon Primarchhood and just basically chilling on Medrengard, such as when the Iron Warriors descended into civil war in the Eye of Terror. Now, the reason many believe this is Perturabo's doing is because it kind of reads similar to his old Decimation Order, back when he had some of the top ranks of the Legion purged because he believed they were getting complacent, killing 1 in 10 of them to make room for new talent. Plus, this war didn't really go past Medrengard. It was very well contained, and after all was said and done, the Legion didn't break apart. Everyone still said, well, glad that's over with, and got back to doing what they do on the planet. And that's another big thing about the Iron Warriors. Yes, they do fight amongst themselves, but all of those are very self-contained affairs. and the minute an outsider shows up, they will immediately close ranks. And it's for this reason they're able to regularly launch large-scale raids into the Imperium of Man, and even take over entire planets for certain periods of time. It's because they have the numbers, logistics, provisions, and cohesion necessary to do things like that. And whenever they do take over a planet in real space, they turn it into a hardened fortress world, effectively leaving it like a malignant tumor in the Imperium. This is as opposed to when other legions like the Emperor's Children take over planets in real space, whereupon they will lord over them, and eventually the planet will more or less collapse in on itself, not being part of the wider galaxy and just festering on its own. And about that, the thing about Medringard is that it's also a big plus for the Legion. Now, a lot of other legions don't have any fixed territory. They have a few places in the Eye of Terror where they can reside, or they just live on their ships, or if they're lucky, they have a few specific demon worlds controlled by their patron god. But Medringard is a specific, undeniable hardpoint that is fully under the control of the Iron Warriors. It is an identifiable, unassailable planet that they can always go to where they know they can regroup and resupply, provided they have the resources to pay. Because bear in mind, the Iron Warriors amongst themselves have a full-blown war economy going. It's not just you get what you get. And since it's not a demon world of any kind, they are in full control of what happens on it. Yes, it is certainly affected by the warp, and yes, it is ruled over by a demon prince of chaos, Perturabo. It isn't really a demon world in the sense that Nurgle isn't going to start shaping things, battles are not going to start erupting around the blood geysers, and it remains fully stable, unlike, say, Sortiarius, the demon planet of Magnus and the nominal home of the Thousand Suns. Also, one thing I like about the Iron Warriors is, comparatively, their very unique aesthetic. They look very utilitarian and almost plain compared to the other Chaos Space Marine groups, who are covered in horns and spikes. Meanwhile, many of the Iron Warriors still almost look like loyalist Space Marines, and in fact have been mistaken as such by some. And in a lot of ways, that very restrained aesthetic helps to distinguish them from some of the other Traitor legions. But I will say, it can be a little bit plain at times. Sometimes you want things to get a little crazy, you want a little zest or spice, so that is kind of a point against them. And similarly, their specialized marine type, that being the Warp Smith, is, again, not that visually interesting, even though lore-wise they are really, really cool. Because, you see, the thing about Warp Smiths is that they're not all Iron Warriors. In fact, you will find Warp Smiths of every single legion, but the Iron Warriors have the most of them. And what these guys do is train in the creation of things like demon engines, trapping demons in these giant mechanical monstrosities so that they can be used as weapons against the Imperium and controlled much more effectively. Which is honestly kind of funny. It's this wild disrespect for chaos, to the point where they will literally use these eternal deathless beings as car batteries. In order to get to this point, they actually train at a place called the Forge of Souls, which is a non-aligned realm of chaos ruled by Vastor the Archifane, whom the Iron Warriors have really good relations with. To the point where other warbands, legions, and yes, even Abaddon and the Black Legion will have to go to the Iron Warriors to ask for the help of warpsmiths, ask to rent out demon engines, or basically just beg for provisions to aid them in their own campaigns. We need ships, we need tanks, we need demon engines, please can you help us? We'll give you a cut of the loot. So that gives them a huge amount of independence right off the bat. Also, another really great thing about the Iron Warriors is their ancient rivalry with the Imperial Fists, because it is very funny and very interesting at times, but it's not all-consuming. They won't just drop everything to go fight the Imperial Fists. They don't just seemingly exist to oppose them and tear them down in the same way the Thousand Suns do with the Space Wolves. So when it does pop up as a plot point, it's more like a fun side thing, something that gives the Legion a little bit of flavor. Plus, there is the funny aside of these guys literally having their own hobbies, that being, they play Warhammer. They literally play tabletop miniature wargames with each other to help hammer out strategies and as a way to sort of relax, quote-unquote. That being said, though, they don't really have a lot going on these days aside from Honsu, who just got back to Medringard, and as such have been really on the backbenches thus far. But hopefully we'll get to see more of them soon. And last on the list, the #1 Traitor Legion in my mind is the Word Bearers. And the reasons for this are actually quite similar to a lot of the reasons for the Iron Warriors. They are more meritocratic than some of the other Traitor Legions, but for them, it's more based on how much favor you can curry with the gods and just how much control you have over the war. But it should be noted that compared to the Iron Warriors, the Word Bearers are way more schemy as a legion, with various Word Bearers always plotting against each other, gossiping about each other, and trying to get more favor in the eyes of the ruling Word Bearers to sort of advance their own positions, which, while maybe not the best for their combat effectiveness, is really interesting to read and makes them a lot of fun, because you get so many catty Marines basically just gossiping like high school girls about each other and constantly trying to make each other look bad. But never to the point of a full Legion breakdown, because alongside the Death Guard and Iron Warriors, they're one of the 3 great legions, having stayed together ever since the Heresy. And while the Iron Warriors quit the Siege of Terra early and as such preserved a lot of their numbers, the Word Bearers quit even earlier than that, with the vast bulk of the Legion never even heading to Terra, instead joining their Primarch Lorgar when he was thrown out of the Traitor War effort by Horus. And in addition to staying together, much like the Iron Warriors, they have their own planet that is directly under their control, and generally speaking, free from the meddling of the Chaos Gods, that being the planet of Sakaris, which is home to the Dark Council. Now, the Dark Council is actually the group of Word Bearers who, in the absence of Lorgar, given that he has spent the last 10,000 years secluded in meditation until recently, have been leading the Word Bearers Legion, and there's some big names on there. One is the character of Marduk, who some of you may remember as the protagonist of the Word Bearers trilogy, as well as Corferon, Lorgar's abusive adoptive father turned pseudo-space marine, and Erebus, first chaplain of the Word Bearers and the literal start of all of this. So that is 2 enormous names right there, and they're always at each other's throats, with Corferon and Erebus constantly scheming to try and undermine the other's plans, objectives, and aims at more power. That's a really interesting dynamic right there. And the Word Bearers are definitely more active in the galaxy, which is partly a given because of this superior, quote-unquote, leadership. You see, what the Word Bearers do, unlike the Iron Warriors who will just occasionally conduct a siege against the Imperium, is go on full, secretive campaigns to ferment the worship of chaos in certain places, oftentimes working with corrupted or duped clergy members to spread the doctrine of chaos, and fermenting full-blown planetary uprisings, something that has become a very big problem for the Imperium of Man. The subtle methods of the Word Bearers are highly effective and have been for the last 10,000 years. In fact, it's not uncommon for a Chaos Cult uprising to be traced back to a handful of Word Bearers taking orders from either Corferon or Erebus. And this is one of the things that actually puts them above the Iron Warriors, even though the gap between the two for the top spot in my mind was like razor thin. The fact that the Word Bearers have been significantly more active in combating the Imperium, and ever since the 13th Black Crusade and the opening of the Great Rift, they have been moving at a run to start getting things done and taking to the battlefield in numbers heretofore unseen since the Heresy. Plus, in relation to characters, I would say that while Hansu is really great and definitely better than Marduk in my opinion, nobody can really compare to Corferon and Erebus. So the Legion having those 2 incredible legacy characters, in my mind, really just puts them on a whole nother level. And that's not even factoring in the very fun and interesting dynamic the 2 of them have. Because they are on the same side, they do not war with each other openly, but they despise each other. Plus, the Word Bearers also have their own specialist kind of unit that, similar to the Warpsmith for the Iron Warriors, is available to all other legions, but exists in the Word Bearers in inordinate numbers, to the point where other legions need to effectively rent them out and beg for their support. And in this regard, I am talking about the Diabolists, that being specialized sorcerers who focus mainly on the summoning and control of demons. Because while demon engines are great, they are still effectively more standard weapons, albeit a little bit spicier. However, demons themselves are on a league all on their own. They are powerful, they are dangerous, and they are one of the few things the Imperium really struggles to combat. In fact, even the existence of these things is like a mimetic death sentence to a lot of people. So it is in no way uncommon for other large groups of Chaos Space Marines, including Fabius Bile and his crew, as well as Abaddon and the Black Legion, to have several word bearers kicking around, because they essentially had to, one way or another, petition their services, and these Marines will still hold loyalty to their mother legion, meaning the scheming and machinations of the word bearers literally affect all other Chaos Space Marine groups. So that is why these Diabolists will literally keep wearing their old legion colors even when they are technically part of the Black Legion, because it literally signifies to everyone, I am special, you don't control me, you better leave me alone. And this directly ties into one of the things that helps nudge the word bearers just ahead of the Iron Warriors, and it's their aesthetic. Like I said, I love the Iron Warriors' industrial aesthetic, but it isn't really all that chaosy. The word bearers, however, have this perfect blend of everything you would want from a devil-worshipping super soldier. It's so perfect. It really does feel like legitimate Satanism as opposed to just the kind of overplayed aesthetic of zombies or the effective but rather bland aesthetic of the Black Legion. And speaking of aesthetic, there is another type of unit that, much like the Diabolists, are not exclusive to the word bearers, but that they have way more of than everyone else. And that is the possessed Space Marines. That being, Space Marines who have literally become possessed by a demon, willingly sharing their body with it in exchange for powerful deadly mutations and an increase to basically all their physical attributes. But that is all secondary to the fact that they look awesome. In fact, the first ever possessed Space Marines were word bearers, known as the Gal Vorbak, who were created in the lead up to the Horus Heresy. And some of those guys are still kicking around 10,000 years later. That's really cool to me. The idea that the first ever possessed Space Marines are part of the word bearers and are just still there. And it shouldn't really come as a surprise why the word bearers have so many possessed Space Marines, given their proclivities. You know, the general character of the Legion. And it's that really insanely devout and pious worship of chaos as a theological concept, and the Chaos Gods as a proper pantheon. Sure, you have the Death Guards with Grandfather Nurgle and Praise Nurgle and the Gifts of Nurgle and all that, and don't get me wrong, that's a lot of fun, but there's just something so dark and cool about the way the word bearers go about it. That creepy, smiling, dark preacher vibe that they've got going on that just makes them the perfect bad guys. Like, if Judge Holden from Blood Meridian was a Space Marine, he would 100% be a word bearer. So, for these reasons, I am wholeheartedly comfortable declaring the word bearers to be the best Traitor Legion. But what do you guys think? Do you guys agree with my rankings, or do you have a completely different point of view on what makes a Traitor Legion great, and as such came up with a completely different ranking? I'd love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below. Please subscribe if you have not already done so, and consider joining my Discord or even supporting me on Patreon if you can, as it does really help me out, and until then I will see you in the next video.